So here's a fun project. So Five Below sells these cool little hammocks, and they're made out of this kind of cool, like, thick weave material. And I think they'd make a really cool poncho. So I picked up 3 of these. This is what I'm going to make it look like. Just kind of a rounded poncho with a hood with, like, ears on it, and then big pockets in the front. This is the general shape of the pattern pieces, a little bit more refined. I'm going to try and freehand cut this, but I'm going to make a pattern for the neck hole, and also the hood, pockets, and ears. Now, if you want to draft with me, I'm just going to mark a perpendicular line on a half sheet of paper, newspaper, then measure out 1 inch from the edge and draw that line, and that's going to be our center. From that line, I'm going to measure out to 4 inches, and that's going to be the edge of the shoulder. And then on one side, I'm going to measure out 3 inches, and that is going to be the back. And on the other, I'm going to measure out to 5 inches, and that is going to be the front. And I'm just going to kind of connect the dots and make kind of an egg shape. Don't worry, it doesn't have to be perfect. And then I'm going to continue that line down. These parts should be as straight as possible. And now I want to measure the distance of this line here, which I just do by taking a tape measure and laying it across the line. This is 13. I just make a note of that. And I'm going to draw in a seam allowance. I have about a 3/4 inch seam allowance, because I plan to do a French seam on this. And then that's the neck piece. I'll show you how to pin that onto the fabric later. Alright, now for the hood. Oops, just kidding. This is actually 14. I forgot to count this a little bit. This is important. Okay, back to the hood. I'm going to be using this edge as a fold line. I'm going to measure 20 inches and mark that line. Then from this edge, I'm going to measure out 15 inches, and I'm going to mark that line. So where the 20 inches is, I'm going to line up my 2-inch mark. And then starting about 5, I'm going to measure out to 14 inches. Make a mark at 14. And then from this line to this line, I'm just going to kind of graduate it into kind of an S shape. So it should look like that. Now this is a fold line, but it needs to eventually get into a curve. So I'm going to take that 15-inch line and just kind of make a nice rounded shape there. So kind of like that. And then connect this line down to that dot. And that's my hood shape. Now I'm just going to add in seam allowances to this side and this back piece going up to the curve here. You know, I just realized I should make this a little pointed hood. I don't want a rounded hood. I want it to have the little kind of like long trailing point. So I'm just going to trace this down. And from this bottom and this back, I'm just going to curve it this way. I had to add a piece of paper, but I just kind of extend that until it gets to a point. And that's kind of the fun of making your own patterns, is you can change it up like that. Okay, up next is the pockets. Draw out 1-inch seam allowances on the sides, line up to 10 inches and draw a square. Again, draw 10-inch seam allowances. From the corner, measure out 5 inches. Same on the other side of the corner. Connect those dots with the diagonal line, and then another 1-inch seam allowance. And there you've got a nice pocket, big enough to fit your hand in, and big enough to hold your stuff. Alright, last thing is the ears. It's just a square of newspaper folded over 2 times, so there are 4 layers. On the side with 2 folds, measure out 2.5 inches and mark that, and draw a line. Measure up 4 inches from that line. Then kind of make a curved line going up to that point. Add 5/8 inch seam allowances. When you cut it out, you should get 2 identical pieces that make this sort of shape. And we're just going to tuck that over, and that's what's going to make the ears. Up next is preparing our fabric. Now this is a hammock, so it comes with all the stuff that we don't need. First off, we want to get rid of this red stuff. You just have to loosen a knot, and it kind of just comes out. We're going to save that for later. Removed all the cording from the sides, and now I'm just going to iron it. This is technically a polyester. Be very careful. Use a cool iron on it. You don't want to melt it. I think just for simplicity, I am going to undo this stitching. Don't undo the sides. We will use those later. And be very careful. You're just cutting the thread and not the actual fabric. Because this is such a loose weave, it is going to thread really badly if you put a hole into it. So the next step is figuring out how I want to orient the stripes. So this is one way, this is another, and this is another option. I think I'm going to go with this one just because the blues and the greens are more my colors. I'm going to fold it in half and mark it with a pin. Now I've lined them up with the wrong sides facing together, just in one big piece. I'm going to take my neck piece that I made earlier and line that up with the pin so it's right on center. And then I'm just going to cut along that seam allowance. Alright, now I'm going to very carefully fold this in half along that line. I'm going to make sure these are lined up pretty well. And then I'm just going to cut a curve along the edge here, making sure that I'm cutting above these holes. If you're nervous, you can trace it first, but freehanding is usually pretty easy. I'm going to very carefully fold this up and put it to the side. I don't want it unraveling. I've taken the last piece, folded it over again, and I'm lining up my hood pattern, and I see that I'm a little bit longer than I need to be. So I just chop off that piece, and now it fits. Now I've lined up the pocket, so it'll line up with the stripes when I put it down. And then I've lined up the ear, so it'll have a little green tip on it. And then it'll have an orange on the inside. Now I'm going to cut all that out. It's going to cut out 1 ear out of this heavyweight stabilizer. You don't have to do this, it's just going to give the ears a little bit more body. Alright, I have serged the edges and the neck seam just to prevent any unraveling. I did the same for the pockets. Also serged the collar side of the hood. And on the back seam, I'm actually going to do a French seam. So with wrong sides together, so the opposite of how I normally do it, I'm going to stitch just a thin seam right along that edge. Alright, that was about a 3/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to trim that down. I'm going to flip it inside out. I'm going to stitch down 3/8 over that seam again, so those loose bits are in the actual seam. And I'm leaving that very edge still open. Now this is where this comes back in handy. I'm going to clip off one of these and then the rest. And I'm going to tie a knot and then I'm just going to undo all of this. And I'm going to unravel all of these, kind of brushed out and approximate in the middle and put the knot in it. And you're going to want to evenly cover it. And take some spare cord and tie a very tight knot. And I flipped it over and tied another knot. And I'm going to secure it with a little bit of super glue. Now you're going to arrange the yarn back over that knot. Now wrap a few times over and tie another knot. A bit more glue to secure it down. And then trim to whatever length you'd like. And voila, you've got a tassel. Now in the inside of the hood, I'm going to kind of shove that right up in there so that that loop is right in the tip. And then I'm just going to stitch it closed. Now I flip it right side out. The tassel's going to be right there. Up next to the ears, so I'm going to put down the stabilizer, the outside, and then the lining. And I'm going to stitch all the way around with the exception of a spot at the bottom where I'm just going to leave it open, trim it down. Once it's flipped out, I'm just going to edge stitch it. And then there's 2 ears. Now I've pinned the ears where I want them to be. The key is to make them as kind of a hook shape, and that'll give kind of that realistic shape so it looks like an ear and not just like a Dorito stuck to your face. I've quadrupled my thread and I'm just going to whip stitch underneath so it stays in place. So you can see I've just whip stitched around and that keeps them pretty secure in place. Look at how cute the green tips are. Okay, hood is done. Alright, pockets are up next. So on this diagonal, I'm going to fold it over 1 inch. Then I give it a good pressing, and then I'm going to tuck it in. Give it another good press, and that makes a double rolled hem. And I'm just going to stitch that down. And I just stitched on the very edge, and then also on the other edge. And that just creates a nice sturdy hem. Now for the rest of the edges, I'm just going to also fold those down 1 inch, giving all those edges a nice good press. The point being that there shouldn't be any rough edges that are on the edges, because we're just going to stitch this directly onto the front. Alright, once the pocket's all prepared, we have to figure out where on the front they should go. So I've just kind of put it on and kind of figured out where my hand would normally go naturally, and that's where I'm going to put the pocket. And I've marked it with this little pin here. Make sure you're putting it to the front side, it will be the shorter of the sides. So making sure the fabric is laying perfectly flat, line it up with the pin and then the rest of the pattern. Alright, once they're even, stitch all the way along the very edge, and then in about, half an inch or so, kind of to match these stitches. And there we are, nice and secure, and it looks nice too. Alright, the next thing I'm going to do is start hemming. Just because it is still in 2 pieces, it'll be a little bit easier to do. Pretty easy, just double rolled hem. Now it gets complicated when I come up to this edge here. If you have shorter arms, you can probably just chop this all off, but I need the full length. So I need to undo this existing hem here, and basically just have to kind of smooth out that curve. On the back here, I did the same thing, only I'm leaving this last little section in the middle of the back open so that when I stitch the middle together, then I can roll the hem over that. Alright, and for the back seam, I'm just pin the right sides together, and I'm just going to stitch it in 1 inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to press that seam open, and since that edge is already rolled, we don't have to worry about finishing it anymore. I'm going to trim the edges here just to make that rolled hem a little bit easier, give the hem a really nice press, and I've also just stitched down the top here, that'll make the next step a lot easier. Alright, and then I gotta attach the hood, which I'm going to do another French seam to kind of hide this seam. So you want the 2 right sides facing out, so the wrong sides together. And I'm going to stitch kind of right just below where the serging line is, about 3/8. Then I flip it around, then pin, and I'm going to stitch another 3/8 down. Alright, the only thing left is the closures on the front. I was originally going to do buttons, but I think this weave is just a little too loose to risk a buttonhole. So instead I'm going to use these oversized sew-on snaps. I'm going to mark it to every 7 inches, and be placing them exactly 1 inch from the edge. Basically just sew those on. It is going to show on the other side, but you want to make sure you really got a good grip on those threads because it is so loose. If you don't, when you pull it, it's going to pull the threads and just be a mess. Alright, and once that's done, it's done. So here it is open, closed. Here's the view from the back. Here it is with the hood up with the back, and then up with the arms up. Detail the ears, and that tassel. And that's a poncho made from 3 hammocks from 5 Below.